12:02 in the east and 9:02 in the west. That means it must be Lunch with Lincoln.
Hey, Reed, how are you?
Hey, good morning, everybody. Or good afternoon, depending on where you are. I am Reed Galen, co-founder of the Lincoln Project and your host for today. Joining me, fellow co-founder of the Lincoln Project, the one, the only, the Rick Wilson. Rick, thanks for joining me today.
Hey, Reed, how are you? How was your weekend?
It was good. How about you?
Outstanding.
All right, well, good. Well, listen, Rick.
Other than the collapse of the stock market, the coming invasion of Ukraine, the general fuckery of anti-vaxxers in D.C., and the usual, you know.
Well, I was going to say, it's almost, B and I were talking about something right before we went on air, and I'm like, don't even worry about that. The world's about to come to an end, so we can push that to the back of the list for now. But it is, Rick, this is one of those things. You think about it. Probably, you're a little bit older than me, but my grandparents, right? Like they were, born in houses without electricity and running water and everything else.
Right.
So they basically, it could have been the 15th century, it could have been the early 20th century for them. And then they had the Great Depression, and then they had World War II. And then they came out of all of that. But that was like an almost 2-decade run of, crap, right?
Yeah.
We're here now going into our third calendar year of COVID. But maybe you could think about maybe it's 20 years on since 9/11 and all the things that have occurred there. But it just seems that, at this moment in time, we can't seem to catch the normalcy of what we're used to seems to be gone, that the abnormal is now, something that we just have to account for every day.
Yeah, I think both the frequency and the amplitude of the changes that we're facing keep increasing. So, you barely get a breath from, the idea that, we've had a Democratic election and gotten rid of Donald Trump. And then 2 months later, there is essentially an attempt at a coup in the country.
Right.
We can't quite ever catch a break from COVID to Delta to Omicron, and we don't ever quite get a moment to recover. And normalcy bias is bad in some ways when you're facing up to these big existential threats like the end of democracy. But there's also a good part about it. If people do want a sense of normalcy and consistency and regularity in the world that unfortunately we're just not going to get for a while now. And the bad guys actually know that, and they want to use that against, people that want to go back to normal, that want to have a regular life, that want to have stability and sanity and predictability.
Well, we were talking a little bit earlier this morning, you and I and a couple other folks, that when we were talking about inflation, right?
Right.
I'm a proud Gen Xer, the tail end of Gen X. Most people like me in our mid 40s and younger, like, we don't remember the last time inflation happened, right? We were 3, 4, 5, 6 years old. I mean, certainly our parents remember it, but this is, for lack of a better way to put it, for, maybe half the country, maybe more than half the country, inflation is something they've never experienced.
Absolutely not. And look, I remember inflation from my childhood. When I was 7, 8, 9, 10 years old, and I remember one key thing: mortgage interest rates back then were like 13, 14%.
Right.
And commercial credit interest rates were in the 20s. Mm-hmm. And that's not for bad credit. That's for everybody. Right. And so we've gotten used to this long slide of basically the Federal Reserve keeping interest rates low in order to keep inflation in check while promoting economic growth. And eventually the bill was going to come due, no matter who the president was. And unfortunately, it's coming due at the same time we have all this other volatility in society, in our politics, in the world. And so, that is something that people in the Biden administration have had a hard time articulating to ordinary Americans, because they don't have a language for it anymore. And a lot of these people are very academic, and they've been insulated by the meritocracy their whole lives. And it's like, I'm not criticizing the Biden administration, for hiring smart people, but a lot of them don't understand that when somebody says, hey, hamburger meat is now $10 a pound and they're trying to raise a family with 3 kids, it means something.
Right.
And you can't just brush that off, especially at a time when all the other strains in the economy because of COVID, because of the way Trump screwed up COVID for the first year and a half of dealing with it.
Right.
You can't brush that off. You can't just like go, okay, hopefully it'll be okay. Because a lot of people are hurting on that front right now. And of course, the Republicans will convert on any trauma or tragedy into a political attack, which is, they've been on the inflation, attack for months now. And they're about to be on the attack of, Joe Biden lost Ukraine. Even though they are, assertively now the pro-Russia, pro-Putin party, they're gonna try to make Vladimir Putin's bad actions into Joe Biden's, political. They're going to try to Jimmy Carter Joe Biden, which is a strategy that most of them aren't old enough to remember, but they know it from our lore and legends as how Ronald Reagan became president.
Well, but there's a couple of things there, on the historical front vis-a-vis Jimmy Carter, right? He was, it was called stagflation then, right? There was inflation with sluggish economic growth.
Right.
We have inflation with strong economic
Correct.
growth, which is not an unusual thing, right?
No. Look, Weimar had tremendous economic growth underneath the giant inflation.
Right. But, the other part too is, Joe Biden's just passed 1 year in office. We've seen plenty of examples, Jimmy Carter and Donald Trump being the last two, where it was events of, the last year and a half of their presidencies that cost them a second term. But for the most part, even if we can come out of this, and it is a very turbulent time, we should not dispute that. But, if let's say even if 2022 is a tough year for Democrats, right, Republicans have nothing to offer. Right, on the flip side, which means that Joe Biden will have the ability to say, well, look, for the first 2 years, here's what we tried to get done, and now these guys. Mitch McConnell even said when he was asked at a press conference, Rick, what do Republicans stand for? And Mitch McConnell said, I'll tell you after we win.
Right.
Right. And Karen Tumulty in the Washington Post wrote a very telling column.
Great piece. Yeah.
Said, the Republicans are only about power, and we see that. And to your point, they're willing now to do anything for that. And I think the other part too is that they have, by their actions, which we see specifically in the embodiment of Greg Abbott and Ron DeSantis, I think they have injected far more chaos, sickness, and death into their citizens, right, because of their stances, only worried about a very narrow slice of the most MAGA radical, Republican voting base. That, 70,000 Texans are dead. I don't know how many tens of thousands of Floridians are dead. And everybody's sick of the chaos in schools and in their healthcare and their jobs. And Rick, in places like Florida and Texas, you can't blame it on the teachers' unions, right?
The teachers' union here could not organize a 2-car motorcade.
Right.
They have their power, if it existed in the way Republicans described it, waned in the late 90s and early 2000s when Jeb did education reform. But right now, people in Texas are even Republican. We heard from a friend of ours this weekend that even Republicans in Texas, during some door knocking that was happening last weekend, were saying, like, I don't want any more of the noise and the craziness. They're sick of even the thing that works to keep the MAGA base revved up and to keep the email fundraising rolling for Abbott is starting to take those suburban Republicans that we've been very good at talking to in the last 2 years. It's starting to make them feel like, God, do I really want to do this again? And they're going to think about, I think, in 22, if we do our jobs and other groups do their jobs correctly, a lot of those Bannon line voters, those soft Republican voters, who frankly, Glenn Youngkin persuaded them this year over schools. He persuaded them. Okay, I'm not going to be a crazy person, and I just want to help you get your kids back in school. That's it. I'm a nice guy. I'm a nice suburban dad. If we can show them that these Republicans really always are what we say they are, chaos, noise, hate, the increasing levels of conspiracy theories and violence that imbue the Republican, establishment for what it's worth.
Right.
I think we have a chance to move some real votes in 2022. But it's also going to take the Democrats getting their act together, and it's going to take the Democrats stopping the circular firing squad.
Yeah, well, I think that Youngkin's a good example, and then I want to go back to Florida, Rick, is that, we always say, we don't operate in a vacuum and politics doesn't operate in a vacuum. In that particular race, Youngkin did because he was not defined early or frankly at all by his opposition. Remember when right after he basically bought his own primary, and then once he won it, he extolled the virtues of Donald Trump and how we agree on so many things. And, a lot of those Northern Virginia voters that I know and worked with at the White House, right, doesn't want anything to do with Donald Trump. So by the time, everybody said, okay, well, we need to show him as just sort of a Trump and Romney clothing, it was October and it was too late, right? Just
And
120 days of being the guy in the vest saying, I'm not that bad, took its toll. And,
he spent $12 million of his own money.
But those 80,000 votes were there for McAuliffe.
Yep. He spent $12 million of his own money for months, and McAuliffe was not hitting him on the thing Youngkin gave everyone all the tells they needed to see. Right. He was running two separate campaigns. Everybody saw it. Nobody really talked about it. He was running a campaign in Northern Virginia where he was the suburban dad in the sweater vest, the McKinsey consultant, the business dude. Right. And in Southwest Virginia and everywhere else in the rural parts of Virginia, it was, MAGA, QAnon, crazy town. Right. And McAuliffe never held him to account for that. I think one of the lessons that we've learned, I hope other people have learned, is that is an early thing that you have to do in these Republican races now. You have to make sure that you force even the normal Republican to own all of the nutcases in the party. You've got to push all that onto them. So they're going to try. Mitch McConnell's trying to engineer, a non-crazy, non-Trump candidate in Pennsylvania and in Ohio and elsewhere, so that he can go in and say, this guy's just like Glenn Youngkin. And honestly, there are even some friends of ours who are in the not Trump but still Republican movement, who were like, oh, thank God for Glenn Youngkin or Chris Sununu or what. The problem with all those people is that once they're in office now, they have to govern as Trumpers.
Right. And we saw that with Youngkin. That's what we were saying about Youngkin. I'm like, even to some of, a woman I've known in Northern Virginia, because I grew up there for decades, I said, as soon as he takes office, he will be unwilling and unable to defend himself against the right wing.
Right.
We'll immediately start in on him, and he will do whatever it is he thinks he needs to placate them, which we've seen with other Republicans. We've seen it with Facebook and all these other people, right? Yep. They fear the trolls more than anything else, even when the trolls have no real power or real authority until and unless, Rick, you give it to them, in which case they do have power.
Sure. And folks, it's important to remember, Glenn Youngkin's consultant is a guy named Jeff Rowe. Jeff Rowe's a very, very bad dude. But he's also Ted Cruz's consultant. Mm-hmm. He also does work for this guy you might have heard of named Jared Kushner. They're best buddies.
Right.
So none of this pretend game of I'm the moderate Republican, I'm not like Trump, I'm a decent dude, exists at all in the party.
Right.
It's just a fake. It's a head fake. And you'll see that coming up in 22. And we'll be here to point out an awful lot of those people and smack them around and show exactly who they really are.
So let me go down the street from where you live to the state capitol there in Florida. So you've got Ron DeSantis, who's in this sort of flare-up phase of his conflict with Donald Trump.
Yeah.
It's interesting that he went on the podcast of McConnell's handpicked toll booth attendant Josh Holmes to basically take his first big shot at Trump. And I'm sure Rick, one of his consultants, either Heath or the other one, said, we have to like give ourselves a little elbow room now. If we do it now, right, then we'll have the space down the road, in 23, when we start running for president, where we can move back on this. But in the meantime, like DeSantis is doing a lot of the same stuff that Abbott is, of course, without we don't know who his opponent will be yet, but You know, in last week, a federal judge said to the state of Florida that its attempt to silence University of Florida professors from testifying against the state in their personal capacities was a lot like the Chinese Communist Party in Hong Kong.
Yeah.
Right? Like you can't silence people because you don't like what they might say. He said that, right? That was a federal judge, not us.
Right.
You see that, you know, DeSantis has now formed his not first, but second, you know, sort of weird extrajudicial, you know, police force.
Police force, right.
Elections police force.
And I'm told that bill, by the way, is going through the legislature right now like crap through a goose. It's going to pass. He's going to sign it.
You remember, too, he's also, in last year's legislature, remember, they passed anti-riot legislation, which said if you happen to be in the place where, like, a window gets broken, right, even if you had nothing to do with it, there's a couple felonies headed down the line, which obviously is you know, an attempt to prevent people from, you know, assembling under the...
I can't wait for that one to actually finally hit the Supreme Court because it's the most egregious free speech violation. It is an actual First Amendment violation, unlike what most right wingers think. Oh, Twitter banned me. No. This is a government exercising power to restrict free speech.
So, and then, you know, Rick, because if you're going to be bad, you might as well be all the way bad. They're also pushing a bill, you told me about this morning, that would legalize puppy mills.
Yeah, I mean, the bill is... on paper, it's like, oh, it will prevent localities from passing laws to ban puppy mills. I'm like, what the fuck is wrong with these people? Sorry, folks. Right. I'm trying to curse less on the air, but that deserves it. I mean, the idea that you're going to make it illegal to ban puppy mills, you're going to be pro puppy mill. I get the trolling aspect of all things Ron DeSantis, but the fact that bill is being pushed by some of his biggest allies right now, it's insanity.
But like, who's the puppy mill lobby, Rick? Like,
I know who the puppy mill lobbyist is. He's a very powerful guy. He's like one of these big swinging dicks in the Republican Party, and you're just like, it's just like, how do you wake up in the morning and think I'm going to lobby for puppy mills? You know, well, years ago, I turned down a client. This guy called me and said, "Yeah, we're the payday loan people. We want you to make some ads for us." I was like, "No."
Well, there's a great book that was made into a pretty good movie called "Thank You for Smoking," Rick.
Yes.
Remember, and Aaron Eckhart plays the title lobbyist. He's a tobacco lobbyist, and he's got his son at the Santa Monica Pier.
Right.
And his son says, "Dad, how do you be a lobbyist?" And he says, "Well, son, it takes a certain moral flexibility." And I think being the pro puppy mill guy certainly shows that. But you know, it's also interesting, Rick, because you know, and we shouldn't make light of puppy mills because that's an inhumane thing, and that's the kind of thing that will weirdly rile up suburban moms and kids, right?
Sure.
Like, you know, in the best friends.
I mean, look, I fear Ron DeSantis as a Trumper with an Ivy League, you know, gloss on him, and the next iteration of this authoritarian movement, but. You know, folks, and we're not a policy organization, but
we are anti-puppy mill. That is,
but I'm anti-puppy mill. I'm flat out anti-puppy mill, and I'm going to beat him around the head with that issue until he submits and doesn't sign the puppy mill bill.
But I mean, a lot of this stuff, Rick, is, you know, when we talk about DeSantis and Abbott, because they're avatars for what's coming. Right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And you know, it's, you know, the stuff that we're seeing out of these guys is a lot more like Maduro or Chavez, or the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. This is not the American way to do things. I mean, I just wrote a piece for the Salt Lake Tribune. I live here in Utah about the Utah legislature, where
I saw that was a piece.
Passed a whole bunch of stuff, and the Senate President Stuart Adams said, "Well, we can try and stop us." Right? Like that's not usually the reason why you do things, because
that's not how you're supposed to run a small d democratic system of governance.
No, and as my father likes to say when I was a teenager, just because you can do something doesn't mean you should.
Right.
But so Rick, now we're faced with these, you know, monumental races. But to your point, you know, Ron DeSantis and Abbott are pretenders. They're saying all the right things.
Oh, yeah.
But it's sort of like when Trump talks out loud, it's in the original Trumpist. right? When DeSantis and Abbott and all these other people do it, with the exception of a few true crazies, it's like they're speaking like through Google Translate, right? It's not the same. It's not the same. It's the same words, but it's not the same language. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and what it is they're trying to sort of speak fluent Trumper, but they're like the Americans overseas who just talk more loudly, know. And in some ways, it because it's fake, because there's no substitute for the genuine weapons grade, jerkiness of Donald Trump. It will all fall apart when they're confronted by him. Mm-hmm. It will all fall apart when he gets them on a debate stage or when he gets them on TV. And one thing, by the way, that DeSantis has been counting on is Fox has been very, very good to him. Mm-hmm. And the conservative media apparatus has been very, very good to him. He's got a lot of fanboys right now. But Trump is still better TV than Ron DeSantis. Right. At the end of the day, Rupert and Lachlan will go back to Trump. They put him in timeout. He's been in the freezer for a little while. They'll go back to him and say, hey, by the way, you realize that, that Ron DeSantis he's fake. Donald's the real thing. Mm. Greg Abbott. And look, I think Abbott's got very little chance in a field with Ron DeSantis and Donald Trump of making that case, because he still tries to pull his punches a little bit. He's telling donors, well, I got Alan West and Huffines and these idiots pushing me. I got to do what I got to do to win. But I think you're right. It is like Google Translate Trumpism for a lot of them. And they're also trying to find a way to make the National Review guys and the Wall Street Journal Ed Board guys, comfortable enough to say, this is Trumpism without all the warts and all the sores. This is Trumpism without all the hideousness, but it's still, folks, Trumpism.
Well, look, just because, but I mean, that's, this is the one thing, I've been sort of noodling on is that, if Trump is the traditional strongman, right, it's innate, right? It's not, he's obviously very cynical, but his cynicism is so ingrained in him. It's not like something he learned. It's not right. Something. It's not a path to success that he utilizes because he believes it's better or more likely for him. It's just right. Because it is who and what he is. Whereas you see whether or not it's DeSantis or Abbott, even Youngkin or these other, Hawley, Cruz, all of them. Right. It's just they're cynical. You're right. They are the Ivy League. They're born and bred to what they believe is their place in the world, right? And maybe that's the problem with the Ivy League, Rick, is that they imbue with this entitlement syndrome more than anything, more than an education.
Sure. The old joke about the meritocracy being that it's this recursive argument. Well, the meritocracy is good because I'm in the meritocracy.
Right.
And a lot of them believe that having an Ivy League background will now allow them to go out and say, well, of course I'm still a racially motivated authoritarian populist, but I have a degree from Harvard or Yale. So, right. You should listen to me. Right. Because I'm smart.
And most strongmen throughout history do not come from elite universities. There's one guy out of Vienna who couldn't get into art school, and see how that fucking turned out.
Yeah, that worked out pretty goddamn well. If only he had like a community college to go to.
Right. But Rick, let me ask you this. The one thing I've also noticed in the last few days, in the last week or so, is Kevin McCarthy, Minority Leader of the House, went to, I guess he gave some speech in the House conference meeting that said, like, I'm not going to change one thing I do, and you're going to vote for me for speaker. And now, he's going out on some of the establishment podcasts and really trying to push back. And he's got Steve Scalise and right. What's her name, Stefanik there too. And it seems a little bit like these sort of Vichys are pushing back on the occupying force.
A little bit. And I will say this, I think in part that is so Kevin can keep the corporate financial river flowing into the GOP right now.
Yeah.
Because when the guys at Ford or Toyota or AT&T hear Kevin McCarthy, they're like, oh, it's our buddy Kevin. When they see Jim Jordan, they think, oh, good God, the lunatics are in charge of the asylum. But as you and I have talked about a lot, as we've talked about with other people in the team and other folks who know Washington, the Republicans the majority of the caucus next time will be believers in the big lie. Mm-hmm. They will be 100% MAGA. They will have been the products of a process that refined out any decency or courage and made them bow to Trump all the time. And when Trump, as we know he loves to do, decides to be cruel and shitty to Kevin McCarthy, that's Speaker Jim Jordan next day.
Right.
Trump likes the performative nature of guys like Jordan and Gates and all these other people because, they mirror back the kind of terrible values he has. McCarthy has tried to be his own guy a couple of times, and man, that's poison for Trump.
Right. Well, and we've seen that when he has tried that, Marjorie Taylor Greene goes after him. Steve Bannon goes after him,
yep.
Right? The sort of the wingers go crazy, and he has to show that he's loyal enough. But as you know, Rick, when an authoritarian movement ultimately takes over, the people who are trying to prove that they were loyal enough are typically the first people purged.
Correct, so. and it's not enough to say I love the dear leader. Right. It's I love the dear leader, and I'm willing to take his enemies out behind the barn and shoot them.
Right. Or as Saddam did to his number 2 guy when he took over, tell his wife your husband was a patriot when I shot him in the back of the head.
Right.
So one last thing, as we get back to a little bit of MAGA on MAGA violence, metaphorical violence. You've got Roger Stone out there who's now attacking Jason Miller, calling him every name in the book. And yep. Rick, that we're in strange times when there's even one moment of one day where we agree with Roger Stone's assessment of anybody. But
Jason Miller is a repulsive, horrifying scumbag of the highest order who I wouldn't trust to walk a dog. He is a truly bad dude and has done some truly horrible things to people. But watching Roger Stone and Jason Miller fight over Jason Miller's new social media platform, Getter, is absolutely fantastic. And I embrace that. I am, in the words of the movie Godzilla, let them fight.
Right. No, and I think, but it's a good example though, of course, if the Trump movement is a Jenga game, right, and Roger Stone is one block in that, and Miller is another, right? Them knocking against each other is a good thing for all of us there in the pro-democracy movement because we want that sort of thing teetering as much as we can.
Right. I want the era of Trump's authoritarian movement. I want it to get to the point where he's like running around in the countryside in a Jeep with his last bodyguard, mm-hmm. not sitting in the palace. I want him hiding in a spider hole somewhere. And the more those people bash into each other and fight for power in 2022 and 2024, I think the better off the country is. Right. But he's going to be a radioactive force, in a lot of these races. And you're going to see that stuff. That'll increase and ratchet up higher and higher. A lot of these people that are around him now are basically selling themselves as the Trump whisperer. Right. The guy in Pennsylvania, his name McCormick, right. Has Stephen Miller working for him now,
and Hope Hicks and
Hope Hicks, right?
And Conway,
and Conway. So you're going to see these people, that were around Trump, outselling their access. They're going to be in competition eventually. They're going to bash against each other eventually. You're going to see the purists in the MAGA movement and the nationalist movement trying to sell themselves aggressively. And, you've got a lot of people out there, including people who've been critics of ours, who are selling their Trump cred in these campaigns. And they're on the other side of other people from the Trump world in these campaigns. It's kind of glorious.
It is. Well, Rick, I know that on Wednesday night you're going to give a masterclass, for lack of a better way to put it,
pretty much,
in all things politics and taking on the Trump authoritarian movement. So Tell us a little bit about that. B, can you put the URL up for us? My5things.com is where you can register. Rick, tell us a little bit about it.
I'm going to spend 90 minutes going through 5 big points. Then you can see them on the My 5 Things website. The 5 big areas I'm going to cover in this talk. It's going to be a 90-minute masterclass where I'm going to go through 30 years of political experience. And I'm also going to focus on now 7 years of being in opposition to this authoritarian Trumpist movement. And I'm going to talk to folks very directly and very bluntly about how to fight, how to win, how to get into these ideas of a new political landscape that we're in, based on 30 years of knowledge and of helped build the machine that we're now fighting against. It's going to be a great course. We've had a ton of people sign up for it so far. Hope you'll join us. It's and again, it's going to be 90 minutes of distilled Rick Wilson.
Oh my gosh. Well, everybody hydrate before that. So, all right, everybody, I hope you'll be able to register. Again, my5things.com. Rick, as always, I want to thank you for joining me. Everybody out there, we will see you on Friday. I hope everybody stays safe, healthy, and happy. Until then, we'll see you next time.
Have a great day, folks.